Kevin Cheveldayoff said yesterday that there would be a coaching search. Depending on who you talk to, this has been a plan in place for the last couple of years. Maybe the situation's changed with other guys that have been, made available. But from where you're sitting, Mike, I mean, how vast a coaching search do you think there will be? And I mean, if you're handicapping it, I mean, everyone seems to think Scott Arniel is the favorite for this. How likely is Arnie to be the next coach, or will it be somebody else depending on how things go over the next few weeks?
No, I think Scott Arniel is the absolute clubhouse leader here, and I personally would be surprised if it's not Scott Arniel getting the job. Look, nothing is guaranteed in pro sports, right? And so when Scott Arniel was brought in to be an associate to Rick Bowness 2 years ago, I don't think it's not like they said to Scott Arniel, okay, here's the time, you're going to be the next head coach of the Jets in X period of time. I don't think anything like that would have been promised. Was it implied that Rick Bowness or that Scott Arniel might just be the heir apparent to Rick Bowness, who I think everybody would realize, given that he was talked out of retirement 2 years ago, probably wasn't here for the long haul. Like, we weren't getting another Paul Maurice who was going to be here for close to a decade. I think everyone realized that Rick Bowness was a short-term kind of stopgap Band-Aid type hire. And I'm sure Scott Arniel has always believed, as have many, that he is the next guy. Now, again, nothing is guaranteed. It's a results-oriented business. It can be a cutthroat business. So that doesn't mean that they now just have to hand the keys automatically to Scott Arniel because of maybe what was implied when he was brought on board. But I'll say this, if you're the Jets and you are now making a transition from Rick Bowness to your next head coach, I think Scott Arniel checks off so many boxes in so many positive ways. For one, the Jets don't need to blow this up at all. Again, they're just coming off a 52-win Jennings Trophy regular season. If anything, you'd like to just pick up where they left off in the regular season next year. Having a transition that would go a lot smoother if you have at least some of the same coaching staff on board. And Scott Arniel, of course, was right there beside Rick Bowness. And by the way, he was more than just an ordinary associate coach this year. As we know, he was a head coach at times. He had to step in twice, including for a full month, where this team went 9-2-1 when Rick Bowness was with his wife, Judy. So I think Scott Arniel would bring fresh ideas, fresh perspective for sure, but he would also maintain a lot of what this team has done very well in terms of structure. And obviously there's the familiarity with the players, most of whom are going to be back next year. Again, this is not a rebuilding team. This is not a team in a major transitional stage. This is a team that just showed itself to be a real contender, that fancies itself and should fancy itself as a contender for the next year or two or more to come. So to me, Scott Arniel would bring that stability and familiarity, and also clearly his own ideas. He's been there to see what worked, what didn't work. He's his own unique individual. He's obviously a little more new school. I mean, he's 61, but Scott Arniel, I think, would be a little more in tune with maybe the modern player, given, he's not as far removed from being a player himself as, say, Rick Bowness was. And I think more than almost anything, Haas, Scott Arniel has been preparing himself for this for well over a decade. People who want to trot out, what happened back in 2010 or whenever it was that he was with Columbus. I mean, that's a whole different time. We see coaches recycled all the time in the NHL. And so it's not like this is a retread kind of hire here. This is a guy who's been biding his time, paying his dues, waiting for his chance. And yeah, it's great that there's also a natural connection with Scott Arniel in the city, going all the way back to Dale Howardchuk and playing junior with Ducky and all that. But that's not the most important thing. To me, the most important thing, he was just behind the bench when the Jets had the great regular season that they did. He had a very active role in a lot of what worked, and certainly things that didn't work. So let's hope he learns from some things that didn't work and would implement them. So to me, not only is Scott Arniel the front runner, I'd be stunned if he doesn't ultimately get the job. But I do get why the Jets would. I don't want to say it's going to be a really wide net, but you obviously want to look what else might be out there. Maybe you bring a few people in for a conversation. I just think at the end of the day that it'll point to Scott Arniel and he's the guy for the job.
You know, you mentioned I'll say this. I mean, I think there's a ton of positives in, maintaining, a familiar face and voice and a guy that was a big part of it. I do wonder, especially looking back at the playoffs are so fresh. That is what, they'll look to change next time. I mean, the regular season, no one has any complaints with that.
Right.
It's about, how you can take that next step. Special teams is a big part of it. And I believe it was Brad Lauer that kind of handled the power play, which was a major issue for a good portion of the year. But let's just say that it wasn't the finest moment for the PK during that time.
No.
And at times, a team that had historically been quite good on the PK, that wasn't it. And that's something that's directly on that coach. Do you think that will be impactful at all? I mean, as far as the final decision?
Well, I think that's a part of the evaluation that's going on is why special teams were anything but special this year. And it should be. I mean, this team had too much talent to be where they were on special teams. And certainly what was a weakness during the regular season became a glaring weakness during the playoffs, where the Jets were absolutely schooled on both the power play and the penalty kill. And, it showed in a 5-game exit. So, yeah, I mean, look, if Scott Arniel gets the job, there's going to have to be at least one new assistant that's hired to round out the coaching staff to take Scott Arniel's position. I'm also not saying that absolutely everybody has to be back. And I do wonder about someone like Brad Lauer, given the state of the PP this past year, which was a chronic issue all season long. Is it a slam dunk that he's back? Would they look to, would they allow Scott Arniel to potentially bring in his own, support staff, if you will, which could be a combination of guys that were here, guys that weren't. I think we know Wade Flaherty's not going anywhere, nor should he. But yeah, I mean, there could be some other changes. So for people who think, well, if it's Scott Arniel who gets the job, it's just going to be the status quo in terms of everything that, and people will just want to look at what didn't work specifically in the playoffs and say, well, they're just asking for history to repeat itself. No, I mean, I think there will be some changes, and there should be when they look at special teams. So if Scott Arniel gets a promotion, another assistant has to be brought in at least, and that's if the others are retained in Brad Lauer and Marty Johnson. And, it'll be interesting to see what the division of duties, who's responsible for what roles and what that looks like. So, yeah, I mean, I think that has to be on the table, Huss, because special teams really killed the Jets this year. And I saw a really interesting graphic last night that actually showed this. Did you see that? The 16
know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. The 16 teams in the playoffs. So someone did a graphic where you basically add the power play and the penalty kill percentages together and you get a total. And I mean, the old story is that you want to be above 100%. If your PP and your PK is above 100, you're probably in good shape. But this was clear as day. There it is. Look at the 8 teams that advanced. That's the best 8 teams on special teams. And what are the Jets at? It's hard to read the fine print there. I think that's 13.
Jets were 20. Yeah, they're 13th. They were 23% on the power play and an ugly 63% on the PK.
Yeah.
For 86, and they lost. The bottom line is that the top 8 teams in power play and PK are the 8 teams that are still playing right now, and the 8 teams that lost the special teams battle are all making tee times.
By the way, RIP the Los Angeles Kings at 55%. I mean, it's one thing they were basically giving up a power play goal every 2 chances the Oilers got, and then they didn't score any. There's 0%. That is That is ugly. But yeah, I mean, that shows it pretty clearly. And I'm not saying that was the only difference in the Jets versus the Lightning, but that played a big role for sure. And so that is something that needs to be addressed in the offseason, whether it's a change in personnel, a change in structure. I mean, I think you look at that, again, really small sample size, 23% on the power play. That's actually not bad. You take that if every 5 games your team could go 23%. Hey, that's not bad. The penalty kill, though, which Scott Arniel was responsible for, that was ugly. And I mean, part of it was the Avalanche were really good on the power play. And as we heard from Connor Hellebuck last week, like he figures he didn't see half the shots that went in. So the Jets didn't adjust the way they needed to. I suppose the argument would be, though, if Scott Arniel is promoted to head coach, he's probably not handling the PK next year. And maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. And, I mean, Arnie's at the top of the list just, because we have kind of assumed that. I mean, just with the way things have went, when you bring in an older guy like Rick Bowness at a time where many people thought Scott Arniel was going to be the choice 2 years ago. And again, having a big part of, 2 seasons that really did exceed most people's expectations. And then the connection with the organization, the history with the Moose, where he did a very good job coaching, which ended up getting him his NHL gig. The one other thing I will say, and I mean, this is not unique to the NHL, but pro sports in general, is often younger coaches get a chance somewhere where they're just taking whatever chance that they get.
Yeah.
And it doesn't go particularly well. And they have to work and bide their time and work to get another opportunity. But those failures and what they learned about the job and the challenges create a person much better equipped to handle what is coming as head coach. And I think if you combine that with his experience with this club, I mean, very few people will know the ins and outs and the insides of the Winnipeg Jets, what made them successful, what they need to do better, than a guy that had such a major role under Bones for the last 2 seasons.
Yeah, and again, I don't get the sense. I know some people, because people are always excited about what else is out there, right? I just don't get the sense that Scott Arniel will be, if the news is that Scott Arniel is the coach, I don't think in this market there's going to be a collective groan, and there shouldn't be, because again, you have to remember what this Jets team just did. And I know recency bias, people will just look at the 1-4 record in the playoffs this year. But this is a Jets team that did some great things, and Scott Arniel, his fingerprints were all over it, much more so than your typical associate head coach. And not only in that he took the reins fully for that 12-game stretch in late October into November where they went 9-2-1. I can tell you, Huss, he was much more active than a typical associate, even when Rick Bowness was around. Part of that is, again, Rick Bowness had other things on his plate, family issues, health issues, and also I think he delegated a lot, and he was bringing Scott Arniel very much into the mix. I also think, Huss, that as part of the conversation with Rick Bowness in him saying he wasn't going to be brought back, no doubt Kevin Cheveldayoff, Mark Chipman, and others will be picking his brain as to what they think this team needs. And again, this is a team that has undergone quite a bit of instability in recent years. Rick Bowness was brought in to help bring stability. Scott Arniel would be continuing the stability that is now in place. I think he's, despite what someone like Mike Commodore says, who clearly holds a grudge from something that happened 15 years ago.
There's a few guys on his list.
Yeah, exactly. Which to me, I mean, at some point, maybe the problem is you, not everyone else. When you've got a long list of everybody that has wronged you, maybe you're the problem. But despite what he says about players and how they view Scott Arniel, I mean, Mike Commodore doesn't know Scott Arniel from a hole in the wall over these last 15 years. And I can tell you, being around the team every day, I actually did a big feature over the winter about how the Arniel, Lauer, Johnson trio kind of took over when Rick and his family needed help. And, I talked to all the assistants. I talked to tons of players, some of them on the record, some off the record. Scott Arniel is universally respected in that room. So there certainly would not be a disappointment from players. Are there some candidates out there that would maybe move the needle in some people's eyes more than a Scott Arniel? I guess. My colleague Kenny Weeb did a nice job yesterday. He kind of put together a box on some prospective candidates. Obviously, a guy like Craig Berube won a cup. The Jets saw a lot of Craig Berube. He's a guy that I think a lot of people would be interested in. Me, there's probably a good chance he's the next coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs. We'll see how that shakes out in the coming days. But don't forget, and you want to talk about recency bias, the St. Louis Blues, they fired Craig Berube this year because they didn't feel like he was getting enough out of that team. So you want to talk about what have you done for me lately? Craig Berube, there's a lot of really interesting elements to him, but a Blues team that didn't even make the playoffs this year decided that they were better off without him. And there's some young coaches too. Kenny outlined a guy like David Carl, who I got to see him and his team up close when I covered the Frozen Four a couple weeks ago. He's a 34-year-old who's very much a hot young candidate to be a really good future NHL coach. But again, if you're the Jets, Huss, are you even considering bringing in a 34-year-old first time right out of college? I don't think that's what this group needs right now. I just don't. I think where they're at, they need stability. They need continued structure. And Scott Arniel is a guy that has been a part of building that over the last 2 years. And to me, allowing him to continue building that makes the most sense.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at Ken's piece, I mean, there's a few other names. You mentioned Carl. Berube, and listen, dude, the best, like, everybody gets fired. That's the whole nature of this thing. The minute they feel like, and there is maybe not as much here, certainly with Maurice, but in most markets, there is you realize when the time has come that, you got to make a change. And listen, the job that Berube did coming in and winning that cup is still, legendary. And the thing about it is everyone knows the sort of individual he is, the player that he was, and what you're getting and what that team is getting when he comes in. We don't know as much about the likes of Todd Nelson. Jay Woodcroft is interesting because, I still, we talk about the Oilers. We just had Tom Gazzola on talking about this series coming in. I mean, it's hard to believe that this is the same season that Woodcroft started out as the head coach for, that Edmonton was
Stanley Cup favorite.
No, you didn't know how to describe how bad they were during the first 6, 7, 8 weeks of the season. And I mean, how much this is Knobloch and the job that he's done, or just the fact that the water rose to the level that you were expecting at it and that they're doing it. But I mean,
Woodcroft, that's my take of it.
For sure.
Yeah. And I saw Woodcroft recently did an interview where he said he hasn't even been able to watch any, because I got to think he's probably just burning inside thinking, where the hell was this effort when he's the scapegoat. He was the guy that paid.
I'd be sick to my stomach every time turning the television on to watch that team, knowing the talent that was there and what they did for him at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, no, Woodcroft was an interesting name. I mentioned actually to Kenny yesterday that he was someone certainly on my radar a little bit. And there's a connection. Obviously, his brother was an assistant here in Winnipeg for a few seasons with Paul Maurice. So, and we know there's a guy who he is like burning to get back in the league and would have an enormous sized chip on his shoulder to prove people wrong. So, yeah, I mean, there's some interesting candidates. The Jets just went through this process, obviously, 2 years ago.
Do you recall how many people they actually contacted and interviewed 2 years ago?
Like, for some reason, I don't specifically know, only that the number like 6 or 7 sticks out in my mind. That, like, I mean, I know they brought in John Tortorella because Kevin Cheveldayoff actually spoke about how interesting the conversation with Torts was. I heard that Torts pulled absolutely no punches and kind of tossed a few grenades at Kevin Cheveldayoff's feet in terms of, telling some hard truths from an outsider's perspective about what he's heard about the state of the Jets room, the state of the Jets culture. As much as Rick Bowness has kind of mentioned that broken culture and needing to fix it, a guy like Torts would have come in with both barrels ablazing. And so I know he was one that obviously got interviewed. We know Barry Trotz got interviewed, and that ultimately didn't go anywhere. And for people thinking maybe now Barry Trotz will want this job, no, I think he's quite happy as the GM with the Nashville Predators. He settled into an entirely new role in that market, which obviously has a huge meaning to him. So Barry Trotz will not be a candidate for this job. But yeah, I mean, I would think the Jets will want to do their due diligence. So for folks expecting an announcement in the next day or two about whether it's Arniel or someone else, I don't think that'll be the case. There's no need to rush into this. You might as well survey the landscape, get a sense of what's out there. And hey, at the end of the day, even if you're leaning towards Arniel, bringing in some other candidates, getting their perspective. Again, we heard 2 years ago how valuable that was to the whole process for the Jets to hear what others, ideas others had, perceptions others had. If I'm the Jets, I'd want to hear that now, 2 years later. And maybe you hear some things that surprise you or eventually do cause you to look in another direction. But again, if I'm handicapping the race, I'd have Scott Arniel at about a 75% favorite in my eyes anyways. And, the field would be the other 25%. Hard to exactly say who that field consists of, but I'm sure the Jets will at least bring in a few folks for a shot.
Yeah, no, and I mean, listen, I think you're right. I mean, they certainly, I don't think, need to hurry to hire Arnie. No. He's here, he's in house. I think we all know where he sits and, wanting the gig. You might have to work a little quicker for some of these others because of just, the amount of empty chairs there are in the NHL. But
one less today. I don't know if you saw, I believe the St. Louis Blues made Drew Bannister official that they, so I think that
Bannister in St. Louis and Travis Green in Ottawa. So a couple of less chairs. Well, we're still going to wait to see if Sheldon Keefe is going to be available.
Yeah.
Or whether he's going to be back. He's going to be an interesting guy. When he gets another opportunity, I don't know what it is about Keefe, but I actually do think really highly of him, and I think he will have success. And if he does get let go for the Leafs, there's a guy that will have an Andrew Harris-sized chip on his shoulder wherever he is.
And I wonder, Huss, I do wonder if there's a domino or two still to fall here, because we know Kyle Dubas thinks the world of Sheldon Keefe. And obviously they have Mike Sullivan, but they just fired one of his assistants the other day. And all reports is that was over Mike Sullivan's dead body, Todd Reardon, that Mike Sullivan he was adamant that Reardon not be fired, and they did fire him. And that's led to speculation. If Keefe is fired, does Dubas then look to bring Keefe into Pittsburgh? And obviously now Mike Sullivan would be in hot demand. There's a team like the New Jersey Devils.
Well, yeah, there's been rumors that New Jersey wanted him and potentially maybe they might be able to trade him. And then,
we might have a coach trade. That would be incredible.
I'll tell you what, we'll have plenty of time to talk about this. And again, start getting into, the coaching story is sort of dominating this week, but also how different this team will look next season. And we'll get into that next week.